Hi, Sweta.
Hi, I'm just trying to figure out my video. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Are
It's
you in
good.
India?
I am. I just got here.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
It would have been great to have this in person, but anyway.
You know, I'm so glad we're doing this, but you're right. It's been so nice to have it in person. And, maybe we can do something else soon. I'm here for a good chunk. I have a sabbatical coming up, so I'm here for a good chunk of time.
Excellent. Yeah, you must tell us when you're in Bangalore and
Are
we'll
you?
do something.
I will. It's so nice to finally meet you.
You too.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we have common friends because you went to Nalsar around the same time that I went to NLS.
Did I? Okay. Yeah. No, we definitely have at least 2 friends in common.
Okay.
Shandi and Rohit have mentioned you because you were and you came to do and you came for your PhD just as I was leaving law school to go to do, I mean, you started just after I started mine.
Oh, okay. Excellent. And you were in UCI law at the moment, right?
I'm at UCI now. Yeah.
In the law school.
I am. Yeah, my full appointment's at the law school, but I have an affiliation with sociology and Asian American studies.
Right. I saw that on the faculty webpage.
Yeah.
And did you just get there, or have you been there for a while?
I've been there 4 years. So this is I've been there 3 years. I'm in my 3rd year.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually really nice. I've
Been for a while.
Yeah, it's nice to come back to California. It's very different from the Bay Area, but it's sort of really nice to be back.
Yeah. Because you went to Stanford for your PhD, right? So you've been in the...
Yeah, and it's just, I feel like, I was in NYU, I was in Abu Dhabi for a couple of years for a postdoc.
See.
And I feel like in the middle of a postdoc, you really could go anywhere. And so you don't know, like everything feels possible. And so to come back, no one ever imagines when they live in California that they're going to come back to California to live forever.
Sure.
It's just not, I mean, you can't afford to think like that because those jobs are so ridiculous. So I feel very lucky.
And how's the UCI sociology, anthropology scene? I'm not sure.
Really fun. Like, I don't know if you're ever interested in visiting or doing stuff. Like I'm trying to start. I just got tenure last 3 days ago. And the great thing about this is that now I can start really thinking about what to do with it, right? Like I can start thinking about how do I build with people I want to build with, and how do I start thinking? And so part of it's really trying to think through connections with, there isn't a lot of global studies that happens, or there's a great, Eve Darian-Smith runs the global studies department, but they're not really always talking to sociology because we have a law and society program. And that's become the main place where a lot of those conversations happen. So the sociology department, much like most American sociology departments is just incredibly American. So
I've heard that.
Those are the 2 international students in that department are my graduate students.
Okay. That has to change.
Yeah, it's really exhausting because I feel like, especially when I was just starting, it felt really exhausting to have this. Hey!
Hi. Can you hear me, both of you?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Time is it there?
What time is it? It's 1:30.
Oh, okay. It's not terrible. It's not a terrible.
No, it's quite good actually.
Sheila, I knew the second we started getting excited about seeing each other, it was not going to happen. I knew we did nazar on our own selves. I just knew it.
Jinxed it.
No, we jinxed it ourselves. We were so excited. And then when this happened, we were like, there's no chance we're going to see each other in Bangalore. And then when this happened, we just lost our minds. We got so excited.
You have no idea how much I jinxed this trip. I even packed like the perfect.
I know.
Mother. God.
That's really sad.
Yeah.
And your folks are in Cal.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's okay. It could have been worse because they came here. So I saw them over September.
Okay. So you're not one of those who hasn't seen their family in 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, I was one of those. And then when this happened,
she was, yeah.
And then the minute it happened, Sheila was like, I really hope, I mean, this is terrible, but I really hope they don't close the borders, because if I could not have come home, I would have lost my shit.
Sure.
Not close to being, I would have, I couldn't have handled it. And I have a sabbatical coming up. If I had to sit on my own in California.
Yeah.
So wait, so are you going to be there for months now?
No, but I'll come see you. Just change the world. I'll come see you.
That doesn't answer the question. You're obviously
Omicron.
going to be there.
No,
for
yeah,
months.
I'm not. I am going to come see you, but I don't know how long I can be here.
Where is Shushmita?
She's coming. She should be here anytime.
So are you going to Kolkata at all? But I can't recall now. Did you say you have family?
You're talking to me? Yeah, I have
Yeah.
family in Kolkata, but my parents are here.
In
and
Bangalore, no? Yeah.
For 20 years. So, so in some senses, home is Bangalore. And I'll go to Kolkata in the summer.
Okay.
But yeah,
Tell me, is domestic travel also really stressful at the moment?
Tests sometimes, and sometimes you don't. You have to keep track of the changing statewide regulations. So some states have some regulations, others have something else. It's a bit complicated, but it's still better than international travel any day.
You know, I have to say, when you come from Abu Dhabi, which is where I flew in from, like literally I landed in Abu Dhabi. The Madras person, I went to go get a PCR test. She's like, no, you don't need a PCR test. You're coming from Abu Dhabi. Please get out. Don't waste my time.
No way. This is, by the way, when I went in April, I thought that's what's going to happen in Calcutta. No such luck. Is that Shushmita? Hi.
Sweta.
Hi, everyone. So glad.
Hi.
Thanks for getting us together. So I wish we were in the same room.
I
know.
so wish that could happen, but
it'll happen. I'm not going to jinx it.
They were saying that they jinxed
You're
it.
too scared to go from Madras to Bangalore and you're talking
Shut
about
up. I'm not going in solidarity because you're not going. How rubbish is this? I'm literally not going because you can't go. I was like, if
so,
Sheila
but what's the scene? All of you're not teaching anymore and all, no? I mean,
we are teaching fully in person.
Wow,
God, I see
in
that.
person.
Yeah, full since November through Jan this trimester, we are teaching fully in person.
But India's like over COVID, like whatever.
Oh yeah. And the second wave happened, and then the second wave got over, and now we're in some other.
Kind of like the way my parents are, hobby. You know?
My parents continue to be like this. Like they wear this mask like an accessory. It's ridiculous.
So frustrating, people. This is a whole other conversation. I'm sure we.
I'm sorry. I'm killing the vibe here. I'll be very important and I'll be very formal.
Rahul is saying hi to you, Sweta.
No, I know.
But all webinars must start with like a COVID chit chat. Like what else? Man?
What else is there?
What else is there? Yeah.
But I can't believe all of you have been doing face to face. We haven't. We haven't been in the classroom.
I'm back in a 1L classroom.
How large is that? How large is that?
50 students, none of whom really believe COVID's a thing.
I started teaching a 120 strengths class. I started with a 120.
Okay, fine. Now I feel like a terrible person to pretend that I need to
but how can you social distance? Or is that a very
there is no social distancing? And then you try telling a California child not to drink water, like they look at you like you're taking away their birthright. So it's like
it's fine. We have 22 participants. Shall we give it a couple more minutes, Sushmita?
I think so. I think we can wait until 5:02 and then we can begin.
Yeah. So we began with our classes are the entire batch is 120 now. So we began with a class of 120 in a room which seats 200, but we've seated 120 in a 200 seater for social distancing purposes.
So there is some sort of,
but the state of California does not seem to have similar spaces. There's no social distancing. There's just if you have a computer, it's great.
So I'm just going to post the book web pages from Duke and Princeton on the chat.
I don't have a web page.
You have, Baba.
Really?
You have.
I don't understand you. I sent you this link.
No, you haven't.
I thought I texted you this link when you kept going choo-choo cha-cha about how you didn't have a page.
Both pages?
Well, I mean, to be fair, it's only coming out in fall next year. Fall. I'm in the southern hemisphere. Fall is meaningless. What is fall?
Is meaningless.
I have an entire chapter about the fall in accident. So I will
fall.
The philosophy of the fall.
1 second. Let me just write a welcome chat.
How come this tuke happens? Is it like people coming in?
Sorry?
Like ringing? This,
Yeah,
this
I'll just
Yeah,
turn
yeah,
it
yeah.
off.
People coming in. I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how
I'll
to
stop it. I know how to turn it.
No, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I
My
think
major preoccupation, as R3 knows, the last 2 years has been organizing webinars. So if there's slight variations, I'm always like, how?
what is
They
going
have a
on.
doorbell.
Yeah.
They have a doorbell. We never had a doorbell.
so in the last webinar, it kept happening and I just couldn't figure out how to turn it off. I figured it out. Now I seem to have forgotten again. So I'll just figure it out.
Okay.
But
So
That does
the
feel
IT
good.
person
I
is
think
here.
R3.
Is there there's an IT person, no?
Yeah, but they sometimes don't respond. R3, we're at 5:3. We can begin.
We should start. Okay, 1 second. Good evening and welcome everyone. I can see there are about 29 people, including the participants on our participant list. Welcome everyone to the Double Feminist Book Salon. We're very pleased with the name of this event. It's one of the many NLS public lectures that we've had over the past 2 months. And we're very, very happy to have with us today Sweta Balakrishnan and Sheila Roy. I will introduce both of them in a second. Yeah, so you will see 2 links in the chat box. You will see 2 links in the chat box, which are links to their new books, which are here, which we are here to celebrate. The first book is Accidental Feminism, Gender Parity and Selective Mobility Among India's Professional Elite, published by Princeton University Press. And the second book by Sheila Roy is Changing the Subject, Feminist and Queer Politics in Neoliberal India, published by Duke University Press. Sheila's book, I believe, will be out in fall 22, and Sweta's book is out as of now. Am I right, Sweta? Okay. We're very happy to celebrate these 2 new books with our friends Sheila Roy and Sweta Balakrishnen. Sweta Balakrishnen happens to be in August. We're in August company with her because she's also a lawyer and a sociologist. She graduated from Nalsar and got a PhD in sociology from the Stanford University and is currently associate professor. Can I say that? Between assistant and associate professor.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean,
of law,
formally will be full actually in a couple of months.
Law and society in the UC Irvine Law School, and she's published various articles, journal articles in Law and Society Review and Law and Social Inquiry and others important and renowned journals. This is her first book, first self-authored monograph, Accidental Feminism, and we are very, very proud to celebrate this book today. Along with her, we have Sheila. With them, we have Sheila Roy, who's joining us all the way from Johannesburg. Sheila would have been with us had it not been for Omicron, but we're very, very happy to have Sheila join us on Zoom today. This is Sheila's second self-authored monograph. Sheila is Associate Professor of Sociology and Head of Development Studies at the Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg. She is also famously the PI of a very important gender and sexuality research project called Governing Intimacies, which is funded by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. She also heads a Governing Intimacies book series published by the University of Manchester Press. Without further ado, I'm just going to announce the format of today's session so that we don't waste too much time. I'm going to speak briefly about the 2 books and pose a set of questions for the 2 speakers. I'm going to take roughly 10 minutes and each speaker is going to take roughly 15 to 20 minutes. So we will round up this conversation by about 45 to 50 minutes and then throw it open for questions to the audience. So welcome again. Yeah, the Governing Intimacies YouTube link is on our chat box. Please look it up. I'm going to begin with a quote from Anna Singh's famous book, Friction. She says, to turn to universals is to identify knowledge that moves, mobile and mobilizing across localities and cultures. Whether it is seen as underlying or transcending cultural difference, the mission of the universal is to form bridges, roads, and channels of circulation. Knowledge gained from particular experiences percolates into these channels, widening rather than interrupting them. We must step out of the boundaries of locality to ask what is meant by a universal. I turn to this quote often enough to ask, what is a universal? In keeping with Anna Singh's provocation, I ask today, is feminism a kind of a universal, and how does it travel across contexts and cultures? In response to this question, I find these two books particularly insightful. Let me say a little bit about the empirical canvases of the two books. Swetha's book, Accidental Feminism, is an account, a sociological account woven over more than 130 interviews with women who are advanced professionals, some partners, some associates in law firms, management consulting firms, and some in litigation practice. Are they all lawyers, Sweta? They're not all lawyers. The management consulting.
Yeah, there's a comparison site that's not lawyers.
That's not lawyers. And these are people who are women who are doing extremely well in their careers. And Sweta asks, and I quote, how do we understand processes where intentions have been agnostic, absent? When a set of actors produce a new inclusion by performance that has the potential to infuse its environments with the movement possibility, is it less of a movement for not claiming that nomenclature? I find this particularly provocative. It is this distinction, they say, that is central to this theorizing. This becomes especially relevant when thinking about the perverse advantages of such non-naming, since the act of not categorizing a process may save it from the backlash that its institutionalized naming might have otherwise attracted. How then do we consider the possibilities of not calling a movement or mechanism by its name without intention? These are women who are not by intention feminists, but the professional and personal work they are putting in law firms, management consulting firms, and in litigation practice amounts to certain kind of work of feminism. They are illuminating a particular kind of analytic that they call accidental. These are women participants in this research, interlocutors of this research. Are they feminists by accident? And that is an important question for all of us here who identify with feminist scholarship and feminist practice, for us to consider. If someone comes forth and does not name themselves as feminists, does not call out to claim the feminist space, but does work that furthers the feminist concern, can we call them feminist? Even if they're not self-identifying as one. And I was able to read only bits of the book, but the book is extremely lyrically written. I didn't imagine at the time that I read it, before I read it, that an ethnography of law firms, something that I consider in my own law school trajectory as particularly not interesting, that an ethnography of law firm lawyers and management consulting lawyers can be so beautifully put forth and so lyrically narrated. They are particularly powerful in provoking this analytic of the accident. What happens to politics by accident? Can we say that Gandhi, when he had that experience of racism in a train in South Africa, he was encountered in an accident that changed his entire political trajectory? Can we impute certain kinds of accidents in the history of political movements, social movements, and see the growth of leaders, the growth of practitioners of certain kinds of politics through the lens of accidents? So I think it's a particularly provocative lens that they are illuminating in this book. I will move on to Sheila Roy's book, Changing the Subject, and here Sheila Roy is treating as her ethnographic subjects two, as I understand, two NGOs based in Calcutta. For lack of a better word, let's call them both NGOs. One is Janam, which is an organization that is more clued into this beneficiary mechanism of neoliberal kind of goods and services. Most of them are the NGO or the organization is clued into, is immersed in the microfinance landscape, and is particularly interested in deriving for its beneficiaries certain kinds of neoliberal goods and services. So its practice of feminism is in transacting certain kind of interest-based modalities. As opposed to that, she's studying another organization which is a member of the support group SAFO called SFE, which is a support group for gay and lesbian queer women, and is a more activisty kind of self-identified as activist kind of organization. It is some of its some of its proponents are particularly dismissive of the interest-based modality of feminist practice. Some of them are particularly interested in making the distinction that real feminism requires you to do some heavy lifting. And it is this heavy lifting that Sheila Roy brings to question in this book. And she goes on to discuss a great deal of the debate within post-colonial studies and within Indian studies about the nature of the contemporary neoliberal self. What kind of feminist self has emerged through these interfaces? And she cites, and I'm reminded of Anuradha Sharma's old book, Logics of Empowerment, which is probably one of the first studies of the NGO modality of generating feminism in rural India. And I see this book as a kind of 10 years later, a different kind of iteration of the NGO subjectivity that Sheila Roy is bringing to fore. She's particularly interested in studying late Foucault, the ethics of the self, and not so much the standard biopolitical subject that we study Foucault through, the ethical self, the growth of the ethical self, and the self as a fundamental organizing principle through which she studies the feminist practice of these two organizations, their modalities being rather different from each other. She also coins the term millennial feminism from one of her interlocutors, and brings to question certain forms of new generation feminism, which don't look like old school feminism, which don't look like you're part of a Mahila Sangathan or you're part of a movement and you're doing a certain kind of feminist kind of struggle, but you're still doing some kind of political practice and social political practice that could be called feminism. And it's through these kinds of provocations that I read both of the books, kind of bringing to fore certain questions. Let me pose these questions before I move on to ask two specific questions to each of our speakers. And the questions to me, the questions I'm raising are questions that arose when I read the parts of these two books, but these are general questions for me. What does feminism mean in 21st century India? What kind of feminist self emerges in the interface with global capital in Indian cities especially? Can feminism stand alone as a movement and sensibility without simultaneously joining hands with anti-race, anti-capital, anti-caste movements? What kind of a movement is curated in 2021 through the conduit of an NGO? What does it mean to be curated, a movement to be curated through an NGO? These are some of the broad questions that are coming to my mind as I'm reading these two texts. But I'll pose two specific questions to Srila and to Sweta. First, for Sweta, can you elaborate on the analytic of the accident and its possibilities for feminist theory and praxis for you? Secondly, is feminist membership and social mobility the same thing? If someone is for advancing their career and finding social and economic mobility through a certain careerist modality, does that tantamount to membership of a ensemble of movements or of a set of movements that can be called feminism broadly. So those are my two questions for you, Sweta. For Srila, my question is, so you make that provocation about real feminism, which I'm very interested in, through that quote from one of your interlocutors. What is real feminism, and how do you distinguish real feminism from millennial feminism? And second question, can you talk a little bit more about the underpinnings of the feminist self in contemporary India today, using Foucault or other people that you find suitable as interlocutors? With that, I'll stop and I'll hand the mic over first to Sweta and then to Sheila.
Okay, first of all, thanks for that really generous introduction. You're right, it's so boring. I can't believe I wrote a book about lawyers and law firms, and finding ways in which I could come to it that was not boring was really the journey, right? How do you use your critical self to make interventions about things that, I don't know, for lack of a better term, are not critically introspected, right? And I mean that in a multiple range of ways. How do you do it as someone who is understanding the firm? How do you do it as somebody, from the global south, located in a global north context, for whom everything that you read about India is a developing thing that's top down, right? When I took the book to publishers, one of the things that was really striking to me was the ways in which people would say, why are you studying elites in India? Like, what has it got to, why do you need to know about elites? Because buying an argument where the focus was literally not a development focus was somehow seen. I think there's a subversive task in that, right? Because you're looking up and trying to understand something that others assume is just a function of, either class or caste or any of those other things, which definitely still exist. But because of that meta argument, there's a very little nuance in the ways in which we critically introspect these organizations. So it became interesting to me in different ways over the years. It didn't start as a feminist project. I mean, I don't know how anything that I do cannot be a feminist project, because I am who I am and I come to it with my own lens. And I think of it much more as a way of seeing rather than as literatures that I was trying to talk to. So I don't think it was particularly a way in which it existed or pre-existed. But I will say that, a couple of things before I answer your specific question. The first is the interviews were it was over a 5-year period. I did them in Bombay. I was living in California at the time in grad school. And I would do interviews for like 3 to 4 months, and then I'd come back to California, right? So I would do them, and then I'd sit with what the interviews meant. And there's something about being in the field, as I'm sure, ethnographers recognize this across the board, which is when you're in the field, something feels really overwhelming and you feel like there's nothing new about it. Because if I sat there and I was trying to understand it, it did seem different. But every time I'd go back and quote it and present it to the audiences that I was presenting it, which was primarily an American sociological audience, the interest was always, what do you mean they're doing well? What do you mean women are doing really well in firms at the same rate as men? Because it went against so many literatures that I was being schooled in at the time. And they wouldn't believe that it was just, there's like, this must be a class story. This must be a capital story. So part of the reason I added the non-lawyer interviews was to show that actually if you hold social class broadly constant, there's still something new that's happening in this particular arena that's not happening in other arenas, right? So this organizational production of what looks like feminism is peculiar to a very specific set of circumstances that have interlaid themselves at a particular point in time. So the book really unpacks different ways in which conditions that otherwise need not have come together came together at a particular point in time in a certain kind of configuration to produce this. The second sort of broad point I want to make is that it's not about feminist women. So I use individual interviews and participant observation to actually make a case about organizations. I'm much more interested in that level. I'm interested in how a corporate law firm that would never call itself feminist is actually doing the work of feminism. So it's not about whether women self-identify or not as feminists. And I would argue a lot of my respondents probably didn't think of that as their primary identity. It's much more, how do you think of spaces that are not feminist in the way they're constructed? And I'm really excited we're doing this alongside Srila's book, right? Because NGOs alongside law firms are almost like on a spectrum of how to think about spaces and conduits. You called it a conduit, Atrey. I love that word, right? Because they're doing different work and they're funneling people through, but you don't expect the work of, progressive feminism to happen through law firms, right? Like that's not where you expect to have it. So to me, it was really interesting because I started this project as a how does a globalization of capital happen project. It was a much more how does eliteness get done in different spaces? What is the decoupling agenda that happens project? And to have these interviews, especially in Bombay, where at the time, there was just an explosion of international work, but they were all domestic firms responding to international businesses. And the idea that gender could be a sort of incidental advantage that happened at the time that it did, in the way that it did, was really exciting as a researcher trying to figure out this data. And around the same time, a colleague of mine was doing a demography of lawyers and feminization across the world. And India is the lowest feminized legal profession in the world. So depending on what data you use, it's between 5 to 10% of all lawyers in the country are female. And to contrast that or juxtapose it side by side with the fact that 50% at entry at these top law firms, but also, close to 50% at the time when I finished my data collection at the top 3 firms were female. That just doesn't make sense, right? So you can argue there is a range of factors that produce it. Those factors matter. But how do you think about it? So the focus was always on the organization. So when I think of accidental feminism, it's almost like a clubbed word. I don't think of it as accident that does something to feminism. It's almost like a clubbed concept of what happens to organizations when they are meaningful conduits for a progressive social movement without meaning to be. And I'm putting that out there because I think that changes the ways in which I answer your question about the framing of accident. So as you probably got from even the little bits of the book that you read, I have to say, I struggled with it. The entire book was just me struggling with these concepts. So what you have very generously called lyrical was me anguishing about every word I put in it, because the people I wanted to talk to at the time that I was writing the book were not the people I was in conversation with at the time that I started doing the research, right? So I was trained in an American sociological school, right? I'm training in a way that is responding to advisors that are seeped in specific kinds of politics. And you get a lot of this socialization that says you need to write in a way that is understood by the literature. But the literature that I was writing to was not a sort of critical, trans-South literature. And it wasn't using queer methods. It wasn't sort of looking at this positionality quite critically. So to write it at the time that I was writing it was really hard. And I think it's worth remembering that part of what I was trying to do with the construction of theory at the start of the book and the end of the book, which are the bits that I sent around, was to frame what I did with an empirical project that was done within very specific circumstances, and how I was using that to talk to people that I now wanted to talk to. So I almost think of the book as not the end of a project, but the start of these conversations I want to have with the people in the room right now that I'm having it with, right? This was what the point is. I mean, Sheila and I literally became friends because she read the first part of the book and she texted me and she's like, dude, this is great, right? And I was like, this is who I want to be talking with, right? And that changes the course of how you're writing and how you are prompted to do this work. But the word accident, right? I struggled with that word almost as much as I struggled with the word feminist. And I wanted to talk a little bit about both of them, right? So accident philosophically starts from, first I thought the root of the word was from usidr, which means to kill. And I thought I'd play with that idea, right? Because the idea of theory, it's fun to think about, if you think of something as killing, you kill an old idea, you perish an old thought, a way of thinking. And part of the argument I make in the book is that corporate lawyers in India are allowed to have a professional identity that is gender neutral to a certain extent, because there's nothing that pre-existed it, because the image of the corporate lawyer was produced by this post-liberalization gush. There wasn't something they were contending with. So new actors like, young people and women and minorities, sort of could afford to do a version of themselves that wasn't rubbing up against an old idea. So usidr was sort of one of the ways in which I was thinking of why accidental might make sense. Then I realized that actually accident has nothing to do with kill. It's much more about falling. It's to trip, right? So accident and incident, which are the two words I was playing with, both have the root cedar, which is to fall, right? And it doesn't include the meaning kill. It's literally just to fall. And the difference between incidr, which is what incidental comes from, is to fall upon, right? You trip on something. And accident is to fall towards, right? So it comes from the root word acidr, which is literally to fall towards. And I can't tell you how excited I was when I figured out this etymology, because I was like, yeah, there's theory there. And every time there's a piece of theory, it gets exciting because you can work it back into the empirics. And it mattered because I think what I was trying to make sense of is, this was not supposed to happen. It's happened. What do you do with it? What do you do with things that are actually producing feminist outcomes without expecting to? And is it even feminist? And there's a long line of literature on how unintended consequences get produced. They're almost always negative. And the writing of it is always so the global north did X, and then they tried to, transport it to these other places, but, too bad, decoupling happened. And the result of that decoupling is that it actually didn't trickle down in any positive way. And I was interested in the opposite. There was an opportunity here to subvert that line of theory, and that analysis was really interesting. So the accident is actually a theoretical tool to think of what happens when you're looking differently at places that are not supposed to produce something. And how do you sit with that really messy terrain of something being quite terrible and producing hierarchies in ways you expect it to, but also alongside that, allowing for expansion in ways that you don't expect it to, right? So how do we as feminists, how do we as queer theorists sit with that juxtaposition? And what does that juxtaposition say for other things that we're looking at, right? So sort of one of the reasons it's a frustrating theoretical concept is that I can't reproduce it. So in the early days when I would present this work and people said, that's all great, but how do I produce an accident? Right? And you can't produce it. And it's actually really frustrating to present this to lawyers who are constantly, asking me for like a radio list of like, so then what are the 4 things I have to do to make this happen in my place? Like I can't change when liberalization happened or whatever, there's this flippant back and forth. I mean, one part of the answer is that sociologists aren't set up to actually answer you in ways that are going to be helpful, right? Like this is just I'm trying to theorize a phenomenon. I'm not trying to give you a balance sheet for how you can do this differently. But I think there is something about that tension of like, where do we look and how do we think of temporality? So one of the comments you made was like, yeah, it's an accident, but Gandhi's sort of triggered to do what he did was specific. But then he changed that to very intentional mobility towards intention, right? And I think what is happening here, when you think from an organizational perspective, is that there is a set of circumstances that's produced an outcome that was not expected. But now that we're here, how do we sort of catapult that? How do we change what we have into a thing that's more productive, that's more intentional? And I think that's sort of where that's where this idea of theory for me and method that is transferable comes up from the framing accidental. And I sort of also was very, I sit with these categories very tentatively throughout the book, right? And I call it, sitting lightly with your identities and categories. And I think we don't do enough of that, right? It's very easy to write a book that says law firms are evil, but I don't think that's a book that's actually telling us anything that we need to know, right? Part of the work is sitting with things that are, might be terrible alongside the fact that they actually are also doing other work, either in the same way that, I think sitting with public interest work, right? And I teach a class on legal ethics for first years. And to me, like one of the big, these false dichotomies that get handed over to you at the start of law school is that, the good humans do X and then the capitalist scoundrels do Y. And like, that's such a terrible dichotomous thing because it takes away agency, it takes away pre-existing conditions that might make people make choices that are beyond the structure of their own selves. And there's something about organizational capacities that I think when you sit lightly with them, allow you to sit, sit with dissonance a little bit more. And I think as critical scholars, especially with scholars who are so nervous about calling things the wrong thing, right? Especially like post-Twitter, like everyone is nervous to say a thing because God forbid that thing is going to follow you around. And there's something great about that accountability. But the flip side of it is that no one's actually talking. Like I can talk to the 4 of you till the cows come home about like all the things that I care about. But actually, what matters more is if I can talk to my, incredibly traditional dad who does not already align himself with me about the things that matter to me, right? And so I'm thinking through about how do we sit with people who don't already agree with us and have these conversations? And what does accident do for that? How does the fact that we stumble into places open up other spaces that allow us to have these conversations? And what does that do for movement? Okay, I'm going to stop here because I feel like I've definitely gone over 15 minutes.
No, go ahead. Finish what you were. Finish your thought.
Okay. I think the last thought I'll say is that I wrote this when I wrote this when I was a grad student at Stanford. The data is collected when I was a grad student at Stanford. And then you do research over stages of time, right? And so my political commitments and my framing has also changed over time. And so I want to sort of end this part of the subjectivity with a question, I think, for Srila, and not really a question, much more a comment. Like when I was rereading your stuff alongside thinking about my book, I have to say, like, the fact that these synergies are so interlaced makes me so happy. It feels like they're like sibling books just making friends with each other along the way. And it's such a joy to be able to do this. But one of the things that it made me think of is, what is it both of us are asking these, I think I'd like to, maybe I'm framing this badly, but I think there is a combined solidarity in this project that we might be calling things wrong, right? That our naming is actually not very accurate, and that there's something really wonderful about being wrong about naming, right? One of the big releases I've had with the book is the lack of anxiety I had letting it out. Like before I let out the book, I had this panic. I was like, people are going to read it. They're going to figure out that, oh no, like I'm calling liberalism feminism. And then that's going to be the end of my career. Like they're just going to think of me as this like second wave feminist that cares about liberal outcomes, right? And I have to say, like one of the great joys of having this book live in the world is actually to have generous interlocutors who come to it with new questions, but also to recognize, you know what, I'm probably going to hate this book in 10 years and that's okay. Right? So how do we call a thing and be okay with it not being perfect? And how do we sit as queer theorists and feminists with spaces that are not fully categorical, right? So Sheila and I, on a completely different vein, we're having this talk about, how do we think of categories like queer, or how do we think of categories like, logics? And the timing of it was really heartbreaking, but like we were, Bell Hooks's articulation of queer, right? Like, is that it's not about who you're having sex with, that can be a dimension of it, but it's about the self that is at odds with everything around it and has to invent and create and find a place to speak and to thrive and to live, right? And in that articulation of queer, how do you think of belonging and how do you think of lack of belonging? If like the place between categories is where you live, how do you then find voice? And I think that's something both the books try to do in like slightly different conversations. So I think my first question to you is, how has positionality come up for you and how does that actually serve you? Because one of the things both our books do is really gets intensely personal. We out ourselves 20 times, like at the first 5 pages. It's like, hello, nice to meet you. You don't know me, but let me tell you truths about my life, right? And one of the great joys of being able to do that is I think it locates scholarship. But I'm in a law school and that is not valued. Right? I actually had a tenure letter that literally said, this was a great book. I didn't understand why it had such a self-indulgent preface. I will never forget that comment, right? This is getting recorded. Oh, crap. Okay, so can you edit that out? But then it made me think, oh, part of the logic, which I'm writing to death about, I'm going to write about this concept to the end of time, right? But part of that was, you wrote something that was so empirically grounded, you did all this work and it's so beautifully theorized. Why would you didn't really need that personal story at the start to make this case, right? So it was seen as other people have to do it if they don't have a real data or a story, but why did you have to do it? And part of what I love about your book is the way you frame it with that. And I was wondering if you could talk about your decision to come to that. There's a lot of vulnerability in the book. And I think vulnerability as intimate method doesn't get spoken about enough in these spaces. And so now that you're at a place that I remember dearly, but thankfully I'm a year away from, of like leaving your proofs away, right? Like it's the hardest thing in the world to do because it's going to have a life that you can't predict. And so how is sitting with that like for you? And also this idea of like curation through organizations. I just would love for you to think of the NGO as a curatorial object that's a conduit versus law firms, which is what I'm thinking of. Okay, I'll stop now. For sure, I've gone over 15 minutes.
Sheila, take it away. Thanks, Swethaa.
Wow. I feel like there's like so many ways to take this away. But maybe to start by saying, since Swetha's already said it, that I am indeed at that point where obviously the proofs will come and I will rewrite the whole book, right? So please feel free to, this is your opportunity, people, everyone who's here, to tell me from whatever, the little snippets that you gather, everything that's wrong about this book, because there's still time and hope to save it. So, okay, I don't know. I think it's just so interesting because when I first read Swethaa stuff, and I'll come to the real feminism question through this, Atri, I hope. I mean, just of course, first to say thank you so much, Atri and Shushmita. It's been such a, Omicron or not, it's been a really difficult time. So thank you for all the labor and the energy. And Swethaa is just like the best academic host on the planet. So I'm very grateful this is happening. So yeah, when I first saw Swetha's book and the very powerful preface, but even this whole idea of accident and what's intentional, and then there was Wasn't that a book forum where Nida Kirmani and other people had written, right, exactly. And it always struck me how, in sharp contrast, the subjects of my book are very intentional about being feminists, right? I mean, that's the first thing to say. So I'm looking at activists, whether they are in NGO spaces or whether they are in spaces that became, through the long 10 years that took to do the research and write this book, whether they NGOized, they strongly identify and claim the label of feminist, right? So in terms of your question, Atri, of real feminism, that is indeed one of the things the book is trying to do, not in terms of demarcating empirically or otherwise what is a real feminism, but trying to see what are the effects, I suppose, in contrast again to Swetha's, of the naming, right? What are the effects of claiming a particular normative idea of the feminist and who is the feminist? And then the continual sort of, I would go so far as saying, even defensively policing the term and the scales and the subjects, the scales at which the term can operate, like the grassroots, very easy, and the appropriate subjects to which it ought to be directed, like the subaltern. So completely bringing to bear the specificities of place and time, the whole history of post-colonial, Indian feminism, not unique to our post-colonial context, but with specific, specificities. Sorry, I just said specific specificities, but you know what I mean. So just to go back a bit, for obviously those of you who don't know the book because it's not published, thank God, yet, it effectively started with wanting a sense of, well, what has changed on this terrain of gender and sexual rights organizing very broadly in this particular conjuncture that we call liberalization, right? So that was the original starting point. And obviously I was thinking of very specific debates at the time, which was essentially saying, well, the field is co-opted. The Indian women's movement was once autonomous. It was led by, people who were doing this as motivated by their passion. And now it's become a kind of a 9-to-5 movement where people are basically doing this as a profession. It's become professionalized. It's reliant on global funds and not the grassroots and so on and so forth. So this was the very specific set of debates into which I was entering and wanting to think at that time about, well, what's actually happening in these spaces. And I have to say, I think I expected the story to follow a very sort of packed, to provide me with a counter narrative. I was going to go and talk to a bunch of people who were in actual NGO or NGOized spaces and then say, well, it's not all co-option, it's not all bad. This isn't the terrain of failed feminists. It's, look, there's all sorts of other things happening. People are getting politicized, they're having unintentional outcomes and so on and so forth. Quite depressingly, I found that actually very intentional and good-willed people and very well-resourced, good-willed organizations produced a range of outcomes, some of which were everything from disciplinary to carceral. So one part of the story is to show, and again, I'm trying to bring out the contrast between Swetha's, that the naming, it doesn't matter as much as these outcomes that are highly unpredictable and on the ground manifest in ways that can be contra social justice, that can actually embed inequalities that can be not intersectional at all, even though there is this greater sort of move towards using intersectionality as a rhetoric and so on and so forth. So all of this, it got me to think about feminism, and that's, I suppose, one of the arguments that the book is trying to make, where the Foucault has been very useful to say, well, feminism, how about thinking of feminism as a kind of governmentality itself, right? And does that help us to then not think of, to kind of get out of these slightly tired debates of whether feminism is co-opted by power or whether it's autonomous of power? Because if we think, of even historically, as feminism has always been implicated in power, then we can think of it as a governmentality in its own right. And then that sort of offered me opportunities to think of governmentality also as very much linked to the work of making the self, right? To think of the government of the other and the government of the self as two sides of the same coin. But I suppose the final twist in the tail, which again Foucault helps me to do, is then not to posit self-fashioning. Well, we have various ways of talking right now about the ethics of the care of the self, technologies of self, self-fashioning. And it's always this way of saying, well, it's not just power. Look what's happening to self-making. Self-making, again, is offering all these unintentional, inadvertent outcomes. But for me, the Foucault helps to not posit this kind of power resistance binary. Because the point is actually, well, self-fashioning, again, if we look at it in very empirically contingent circumstances, has all sorts of effects. Very simply put, some practices of the self strengthen norms, some practices of the self disrupt norms. There's no way you can really tell that in advance, right? So you can have a bunch of young queer activists, self-identified feminists, queer, intersectional, who are very much invested in queerness as an anti-normative project. But I show in a chapter that you haven't read how, on the contrary, a lot of their practices of the self, of inhabiting the everyday, is a sort of dance with norms. And those norms are not about gender and sexuality alone. Those norms are obviously about class, those norms are about caste, and so on and so forth. So I suppose to go back to the question of the real feminist, the book tries to constantly undermine that, or not undermine, to ask what is the attachment to the real feminist? And it actually tries to show that in a moment where the fortunes of Indian feminist and queer organizing has transformed radically, right? Where there is more professionalization, there is more access to resources, there is more access to forms of institutionalization. What we actually have is more of an anxiety on what is a real feminist, right? And that anxiety also produces certain defensive forms of defensive forms of addressing critique, which could be made from within the fold, right? So you could have beneficiaries of a feminist development organization saying, I don't want your development, or I don't want it to look like this, right? And the NGO or responds in quite defensive ways. So, and I take that notion from Jen Nash's work, where she constantly talks about, in terms of Black feminists' relationships to intersectionality, how intersectionality becomes a commodity, right? And how it embeds then Black feminists in these very colonial imperial logics, almost property relations, where you're constantly trying to defend and say, no, but intersectionality is mine, but are you the origin of it, etc. And I sort of see similar moves in the way in which, at this point, at least the Indian feminist queer activists I'm looking at are constantly engaged in these defensive ways of saying, but who, you're not speaking on behalf of the subaltern, or where's the grassroots, or how can we, sitting in a flat in Calcutta, be talking about this when that poor woman, you see what I mean? And so there's, now just the final thing, I know I've said a lot of things and not maybe all of it is adding up. The final thing, Atri, did you mention millennial feminism? You did. Yeah, so there's something about so the project tries to also undermine the very use of these very temporally, temporally overdetermined terms like millennial, because partly what it's trying to do is to say, okay, I'm looking at, what this particular temporal conjuncture, liberalization, has done for queer feminist activism, but what I actually find is a lot of continuity. What I find is continuities with feminism's past. What I find is very regional specificities, right? So how does this long history of the left, which is so particular to the Calcutta West Bengal context, how does that inform these spaces and the subjectivities of those who actually have no, bear no actual relationship to the left, which for people who don't know Calcutta is unique, because most people in Calcutta have some sort of affiliation, especially if they're in political spaces. They have some sort of affiliation to the organized left. So oddly enough, if you meet like the student activists who are not subjects of this project, but kind of minor characters, if you want. So if you meet the student activists at Ajadpur, or people who were part of Hok Kolorob, they will definitely have some kind, they'll have like a kaka or someone who was part of the CPM or something, a broader like, but many of those who I interviewed didn't have that sort of direct relationship. Even so, my point is, it doesn't matter. My point is in their, in their everyday speech, in the way, in their charge, I have a whole chapter on, dress and aesthetics. You see very much this embodied history, right? So that's another argument of the book, to say the so-called transnational global, the neoliberal, doesn't simply erase, right? It doesn't simply erase what coexists. And I suppose that comes to that final point about feminist self-making. And I'll end there, like a quick way of responding and again, that was the book, what the book was trying to argue against. The feminist self-making is neoliberal, right? And that's an argument across the North and the South, right, today, that, the feminist, that the gender itself is incited by neoliberalism in much more intense ways. So that's an argument that we have from the Aradhana Sharmas, and we have it from a host of Northern feminists like Catherine Rottenberg. And then you have more like inflected arguments like Himangini Gupta talking about blank noise and Pink Chatti as, neoliberal feminism par excellence. So my point in the book is also sort of to nuance some of those claims and say, okay, maybe it's neoliberal self-making. Let's look at it concretely. How does this actually manifest, right, in these concrete locations? A, and B, can you reduce these forms of self-making to neoliberalism alone? Can you even reduce them to the NGO governmentalities in whose crevices they were formed, right? So exactly as you expressed it, it's precisely to look at that relationship between governmentalities and the self, but not as irreducibly plural as Mary John would say, and to try and look very concretely at their manifestations and impacts in a context where, again, historically, feminists have been anxious about talking about the self. They've been very much oriented towards speaking on behalf of the other, right? It's only with, I think, the queer move that suddenly it's a politics that's actually, there's something at stake for you. Otherwise, the mainstream Indian women's movement project has always been about the other and not the self. So yeah, I feel like I've said a lot, and I'll leave it there, and hopefully we'll pick up on some of these things.
Thanks so much. We're dot on time, as we had imagined we'd wrap up the conversation and open it up to questions from the audience at about 5:50. So we're dot at 5:49 now. Please raise your hand or write your question in the chat box. We're happy to take as many questions. Please keep them brief so that we can take as many questions as possible between now and 6:30. I'll keep a look at the chat box as well. If anyone wants to write their questions in the chat box, or else please raise your hand. Am I missing something?
Can I go?
Oh, sure, Sushmita, go ahead.
Yeah, for some reason I just can't raise my hand on Zoom. So I just thought I'll unmute myself. Thanks both. It's so nice to hear both of you talk about your own book, and congratulations for such brilliant work. I'll start with Sweta first. Sweta, I love the way in which you start the book with that photograph, right? And I think that sets the context beautifully for accidents and what accidents can do, and the kind of lasting impact that accidents can leave. So on that note, I was also thinking and especially when you're talking about family, you're talking about belongingness, I was thinking about these women at the law firm that you've interviewed, and say women from our mother's generation, right? Who were also not, in some senses, accidental feminists, right? So if one has to think of, and of course, these are like two very divergent contexts we're talking of. One is a patriarchal household, the other is, okay, far more liberatory, say, law firm, right? And going back to the question that Atri was asking you as to what does this category, this notion of accident really help us do to understand these different kinds of accidental feminists, right? So that was my question to you. Srila, again, as in I was blown by the way in which you're talking about new subjectivities of feminists and queer activists and how they're shaping themselves up in contemporary India. I was thinking of what does it do to the category of collective itself, right? Especially when we're thinking of, as in on one hand, you bring in the question of governmentality, that feminism is also a governmentalizing project. If that, which is, I totally agree with you, that's definitely the case. But also there is a sense of, like you, towards the end, you said that it's not like the old is completely getting wiped away, right? There is that remnant of the older activist from, say, Calcutta, who continues to self-fashion herself in the same way. So what is this changing nature of collectivity in, say, neoliberal politics, right? Thanks.
Sweta, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for paying attention to that image. Like I really, so for those of you that haven't read the book, which I'm assuming is all of you, the book starts with an image of my grandparents, but it's only their feet. You can't tell. I mean, unless you know it's them, you can't really tell it's them. But it was taken by my father when he was a 4-year-old, and he was playing around with the camera, like outside in the house. And he takes this picture, and the picture is only of their feet. And you know, anyone would have tossed that picture. I feel like in this iPhone world we live in, like, you know, you'd just be like, oh, this goes to delete because it's not a great picture, right? But it's an out of focus picture, and it's just of their feet. And I find it's one of my favorite photographs of them. It's a tiny, tiny picture, and it's my backdrop on my phone. And I use it because it keeps reminding me that, like, a child took it. It had, you know, they broke the camera after it. There's no other picture like it. But if you look closely, I feel like the energies of my grandparents, who I love dearly but and miss every day but aren't around anymore, like, sort of, I feel like they come alive to me in that picture. There's something about looking at it from the perspective of knowing the intricacies and the nuance of what's happening there that changes what the picture does, right? So the aesthetics of sight and space get changed depending on what you know about the production of the space. And I think, to me, that became like the idea of accidental, right? So it's like, what do you do with a thing that wasn't produced, and how do you think through it? And Shushmita, I really appreciate your the logic of this entire generation of women who stayed at home, and sort of within, you call the law firm a far more liberatory space. And I don't think it is. I actually think it's the same kind of space, right? There's a heteropatriarchal script that's inherent in these spaces. And that is part of what the project is. Part of the project is like, how do you look at these spaces, but also have grace for our way to them, right? Like, how do you actually make the intervention of looking at these spaces and understand that there is some agency in which these actors, who it's very easy to look at as these deferent subjects, are producing. And usually that kind of exchange between the actor that's seen as caught within an organization and the power within the organization is always thought of as only possible in progressive spaces, right? So, like, you know, that rhetoric is very common when people interrogate other kinds of organizations to say, of course, actors are subjects, right? Like, sort of, you know, other spaces. I mean, I feel like people who are immersed in understanding sort of, you know, debates on sex work, for example, right? Like, will always talk the ideas of how we think of institutions and like power and the ways in which that get navigated is not a linear top-down thing. It's a negotiable, interchangeable thing. If you pay attention to, you will look at. But that doesn't get done to neoliberal spaces. It doesn't get done to spaces that are deemed elite on their own terms and not terms that are specific to progressive attitudes, right? So to me, that was crucial to the theorizing. So part of the theorizing is that how do we look at spaces that we normally take for granted as X and try to think through them as X plus, right? Not to say that that violence doesn't exist, right? Like, my book sort of talks about, you know, I make this big argument about how caste and, you know, minority status, and also just not being from an urban city. Like, if you're not from an urban city, it doesn't actually matter if Ajay is like frozen for me. Is this happening to everybody? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I also have an unstable phone. I also have an unstable connection, so this might be me too. sorry, just to go back to this idea of who do we think of as capable of doing this work, right? Changes in a law firm. And I think there's something about that. I mean, so chapter 6 talks specifically about families and the ways in which this previous generation of mothers who were capable of doing childcare was central to the generation of women that were within these scripts. And part of, I hope, what the book does is to get us to look at spaces that are normally not looked at and rethink what accidents can actually produce. And I think of that as feminist method, because agency does not have to be the only tool. We can have multiple toolkits. Part of the idea is that, we can have an expansive toolkit that uses tools that might be blunt, but might work to untangle a specific thing that you don't see. I mean, I'm using multiple metaphors here, but that's sort of like what the hope was. It was to critically interrogate much more what accident can do. But I have to say, I do love that the part that's tripping us up here is the accident, not the feminism part, which is the part that I actually am not fully convinced about. But I love that in the feminist book Salon, all of the theoretical questions I'm getting is about the accident part of my framing. Because anyway, I'll stop there with Srila.
Okay, Swetha's just asking for it. Like, she really wants us to get in and be like, why didn't you just call it accidental empowerment? You were just trying to be sexy. Anyway, so about the collective, Sushmita, thank you. That's a great question. Also because, in fact, using Atri, a special issue Atri did not so long ago on rethinking the self in contemporary India and Indian politics, and a slew of other new work, but not that much. I do quite a lot at the start and implicitly elsewhere to try and really say we should take the self seriously. Why don't we take the self seriously? But the book actually begins it begins with the anti-rapes and the anti-rape protests in Delhi in 2012 and ends with Shaheen Bagh. So I had obviously a reviewer too who said, you're saying all this about the self and then you start and end with these huge, massive collective protests. So, like, what's the point of saying all this about the self? And ultimately, so I suppose conceptually I'm trying to say, well, it's still worth looking at these. What is happening, I think, in between these two bookends in the book is these periods of quietism, right? Where ultimately I'm trying to say that organizations, I suppose, like Sweta, of all types, whether they call themselves, in my case, in a much smaller remit, whether they call themselves activists, they say things like we're an NGO, but not an NGO, we're an organization, we're not an institution, like, a Shangoton in Bangla. So all sorts of ways of claiming and doing that kind of work. But all of it, I say, is doing making some kind of incremental shifts, which cannot be just sort of discounted, especially in a context where we really have only privileged the collective as the category of the political, and we really haven't thought enough of the self. Having said that, I think the example of the microfinance institution is a great example of, because part of what they try to do is to create a collective, the dal, right? So the whole point of the organization is to say, women are not coming here for microfinance, for credit. They're coming for dal. They're coming for solidarity. They're coming for the collective. And partly what I do is show on the one hand that that's a totally failed project. Women are actually not going for dal. They're going for money, straightforwardly. But here's where the accident comes in, I suppose, even though I don't theorize it in that way, is to say, but there is dal formation where women are actually, oddly enough, it's not the women beneficiaries directly, it's the women who actually do the everyday work of development, right? So beneficiaries are positioned in the classic neoliberal model as both the doers of development and the recipients of development. So it is these doers of development who actually form a dal and have fun and do maro adda and go out, instead of going to the office, go off and do other things and have leisure and play and masti and fun. And so there I say, which is not what the NGO imagined, or neoliberal governmentality as such imagines, collectivization to be, because they think of collectivization as tied to financialization, et cetera. But here you have the conditions that create women's collectives, but that do very different things in a nutshell.
So Lakshmi is asking, her mic is not working. She's asking the chat box, how do you use vulnerability as a method in fieldwork? The question is for both the speakers. Sheila, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. mostly because I'm writing something on vulnerability as method as we speak. So I don't think vulnerability is a singular thing, right? It's like how you come to the field and how you feel about it. So sometimes you don't choose vulnerability, it is chosen for you, right? If you're a grad student doing this work and people think they're speaking to you because they're helping you do a project. Literally, a lot of people did think they were helping me do schoolwork, right? Because I was in grad school at the time, and I was, and it was, in some sense of the word, I mean, it was labor that was producing something for school. And there is vulnerability that's inherent in that exchange that has nothing to do with me, right? I think over the years that positionality has changed, right? I'm no longer a grad student looking for data, like so now when I do work, it's sort of a very different logic of vulnerability, because the chances that people are going to open up to you is slightly different, because you have access to them, but they also don't, and they've read your work, right? So people are likely to know what my positionality is before they speak to me. Even if they don't read my stuff, they have a general sense of like what my priors are. And so vulnerability sometimes is then unpacking what those priors mean in that conversation, right? Because like I said, I don't want to be just talking to people who agree with me. The part of the goal here is to speak with people who don't agree with you. And that requires making the vulnerable self obvious. So I think it's easier in writing. It's harder in actual exchange when you're in the field, because part of what happens is, especially as an ethnographer, you only want the parts of yourself that are important to be outed, right? So if I did a if I did a project on identity in India, it would be really hard to like not out things that are really relevant about my identity, right? As we've learned. But the opposite, which is outing myself as queer when the conversation is not about that, right, is irrelevant. So I did a big ethnographic project on migrant families, right? So people left behind of migrant families from Kerala to the Gulf. And I was staying in Kerala. I was staying in spaces that, I was staying in a small village for a couple of weeks, and I was doing interviews in the surrounding villages. I mean, not interviews, like I was doing, there were interlocutors that I was engaging with. And vulnerability there actually just meant sort of performing like a hyper cis feminine identity that allowed me to be there without not outing myself was actually part of that vulnerability, right? So it can look very different depending on where you are. Like I think when you choose to out and what you choose to out and what it means to do that outing in a specific way is so different at different stages. But I think in the field, I don't think it's as important as it is in the writing, right? Because I think sometimes, especially when you study up as I have done, it's slightly different than when you don't. Like when you're studying up, a lot of the interlocutors that read your work have the ability to question it after. So you're inherently vulnerable. You're vulnerable when you're actually getting the data, and then you're vulnerable when you're writing it up, because people can either not regard it or challenge it on its own terms. So you remain vulnerable to your subjects in very different ways than when you study interlocutors who are never going to read your book, right? Or who are never going to read in the language that you're writing. So I think this vulnerability is not so much what you do, but like sort of how you come to the field and how you stay in the field, the self-reflexivity of constantly recognizing that people are giving you their stories and you need to be honest to them, but also that, and Sheila, I was actually thinking of this when you were talking, which is this idea of you're also writing about people you might know in other capacities, right? And so when they read this, part of the hard bit is to, if you don't make yourself vulnerable and you have these people are terrible and they don't believe their politics, right? Which then it actually is doing a violence on people who've trusted your time. So try thinking through where your positionality is when you're reporting, well, not reporting, but when you're writing on behalf of others, both who have power and who have given you their vulnerability, is such an ongoing project. And it's not a slam dunk where you can like, I said ABC, therefore I'm done and no one can question this. I stay up at night wondering if like my theorization is actually doing justice to people that I'm talking about. And I think that vulnerability is sort of what I was talking through in when I think of in the field.
Sheila, do you want to add?
Just completely agree. And absolutely, exactly. And it's like an ongoing project. I just think the only thing to add is ultimately, because the book produces critique of feminist practice in the contemporary, because I really was very anxious about, well, I suppose like you're saying, Sweta, these are real people and there's a good chance some of them will read this book. And it may not reflect what they thought they were talking about, or how they were opening up doors to me, etc. So what the book finally ends with, but I think it also gestures to at the start, is to ask the question of what is the, I mean, it sounds a bit, frivolous to put it like that, but, what is the point of feminist critique of activist practice, especially at a time in India where, activist spaces are simply getting squeezed out, I mean, dramatically, right? And ultimately, like from the start and the end, it's to also to show how academics are also absolutely implicated in the same, circuits, rubrics of speaking for, on behalf of, etc., that, that I claim activists are. And I say right at the start, I mean, the only relief I had is that, actually, notwithstanding academic narcissism, what the impact we can make in the world is very little. But what NGO workers are doing and what activists are doing, the stakes are much higher. And that actually makes us feel a little less vulnerable and a little more smug and protected. But then what does it mean to finally eventually say, but, we're really doing this project in similar ways, and therefore what critique is directed to them as it was totally directed to us. And that's also what makes these spaces quite porous, I suppose, academics and activists.
I don't see other questions in the chat. I guess I can ask, I was going to ask, and then I thought I'd hold back. Srila, this is so you worked in the Bengal region for a while. You worked on women whose narratives of having participated in the far left movement earlier, and this is your new project. And Sweta too, you worked on various other projects, and this is the kind of front and center of your graduate work, as I understand. Can you both talk a little bit about situating this work, these two books, in your longer journey as feminist practitioners, as scholars? I'm guessing these two books are not positioned only as scholarly books. So can you are they, or are they? Can you talk a little bit about the longer journey in which these two books are located, and then we'll take Aarti's question.
I'm only giggling because I don't think I can't believe the book is out in the world and that even scholars are reading it. So the idea that not scholars would read it just seems so far-fetched to me. And I'm not just being self-deprecating, right? Like, I mean, like, as you said, you don't expect to pick up a book about law firm or women in like elite law firms and think of that as some sort of critical project. It just doesn't seem like the sort of thing that's going to do that. But on positionality, I wanted to actually just say that Sheila's last point about us being academics is really central and crucial, right? Because who are we to talk on behalf? I mean, we both critique this. Who are we to talk on behalf of others? And how do we think of others who talk on behalf of others, right? We have these long self-indulgent, as one person called it, diatribes of like, what does it mean? But the truth of it is, like, we're both academia is pretty protected, right? So on the one hand, it's not going to have this big splash, but on the other hand, we are getting valued and credited for the things that we are doing and the level of critique that we're making, right? So, and I try to not forget that neoliberal predicament of just having that safety in doing this critique and recognizing that to have time. I mean, my father still doesn't understand how somebody published a book that I didn't pay them to publish. He's like, what do you mean someone just wrote this book? Like, you didn't pay them? And he's like, yeah, I didn't pay them. They just published it. And that idea, right, that somebody will take your thoughts, that those thoughts will become a book, that's a privilege. And I've tried to never forget it. And I think academics have that privilege more than most. But I didn't have that privilege when I was doing this research, right? Literally, when I was doing this research, it is, I have this much money to do field work. I have to do it in this amount of time, right? You're cutting corners in ways that change the shape of what you're asking and what you're doing with it. Like one of the things that produced the most amount of anxiety when I let the book go was how deeply, how little of a caste critique it does, right? Not that every book can do everything, right? But this book, given where I am right now, and given like sort of how intentional and vocal my caste part. So part of the reason for writing that preface and outing like sort of my Savarna fragility and talking through what does it mean to be like a cis presenting sort of forward caste person writing this in this time and date, right? Like it matters. But the book was not set up to answer a lot of the questions that I cared about even then, right? But didn't have the luxury of spreading through, because if I took a book about Indian elites to an American sociological audience and said it's also about caste, they'd be like, hello, how many subversive things are you trying to do, right? But now that the book is actually there 10 years later, and I'm interested in this audience, or I'm interested in sort of engaging with the terrible post critique of like actually engaging with not intersectionality, but taking it as it is, the fact that it doesn't make, I mean, I hate how it falls on those anxieties. And talking about being vulnerable, I continue to be vulnerable on the fact that the book doesn't do the job that I hope it could have done. Like you could say it does, this is not the book to do it, but I think every book should do it, right? Like even if you're able to write about a specific context without it, that's privilege. And I think calling myself out on it was the only way in which I knew how to do that vulnerability and positionality. But I could have also only done that with a tenure track job. Right? I was not writing it as a grad student. I had a contract in my hand, and I knew that I was writing it with a job. And so that positionality professionally changes the kinds of ways in which you can come to questions. And I think that never gets spoken about. It's always just assumed that the best ideas come to you when you're doing X work, but actually it comes to you because you have the freedom to do that and you're getting rewarded for it in a very capitalist productive model. So I just wanted to follow up from Sheila's thought and add that to Lakshmi's question.
Sheila, did you want to?
Oh, I thought Sweta was going to say something about the your question, actually.
Okay, yeah. Did you want to locate the book in your longer journey?
Oh, I don't know if I had a longer journey. I feel like my entire journey was just like, how am I going to get to the next part? Like literally, I don't think this was like some thought out journey. This was an accidental journey. I'm like an absolutely accidental academic, and I'm not giving accident that much premise, but I do think it is such it's a journey that's predicated on just, what do? I have to do XYZ to get this thing. And then I have to do this to get this other thing. The amount of precarity that is predicated, that, academic careers are based on, especially American academic careers are, is this getting recorded and shared widely? I feel like I'm dissing I'm dissing everybody and everything now. But the amount of precarity that is inherent in this, right, never gets spoken about. So actually in my professional career, like I was a corporate lawyer before, and then I went and taught for a year in Nalsa, and then I've been in academia for 17 years. Like, I feel like this is the only ground I'm swimming in. So it's not, and this is my first book, and it's a graduate student book in every way. So I call it agoraphobia in the book, and I really theorize about that too at the end of the book. But yeah, I'll stop.
Sheila, did you want to? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I want to tell Sweta, but she's at least like, she can properly claim the name of a sociologist, because I'm a sociologist who's never had a degree in sociology, but now I teach it and all of that. So I suppose, it's very, I mean, in terms of like academic trajectories, and I think this comes back to, and maybe also Kush Patel's question here about naming. Like, I name myself, and I see the book as very much being in conversation with feminist and queer studies. Like, I mean, even though, I'm in the discipline of sociology, WITS doesn't have a program or a center for, feminist studies specifically, but I see myself very much as a feminist scholar. And I'm at that point where I don't publish in journals which are sociology or anything like that. Like, I feel no pressure to. I think I'm very lucky. Again, going back to what Sweta was saying about your particular pulls and pressures. When I studied and I taught in the UK, and definitely there was a sense that one should do more disciplinary journals. There is none of that here, and boy, am I taking it. And I like that Kush has also mentioned bell hooks, and obviously bell hooks has haunted this conversation. Blessed this conversation, other ways not haunted. And I see the feminist classroom as very much also, a space of self-transformation with a whole range of other effects. I don't have that anxiety that I'm not an activist and stuff like that. But I suppose my work, from the Nakshabari work to the work now, has, I guess now when I think of it, in that long sweep has been about bringing me to Calcutta, which is a place I left when I was very young. I was 9 years old. So I feel in some ways, maybe at some level, it was about understanding this trajectory of being an internal migrant. And then I left India when I was, 20. I've been lived outside of India now 21 years, which is also not things that I kind of planned. And I think of myself very much as reducible to my Indian passport. But I guess the two projects were about, just one sort of odd thing was because I grew up in Bombay and Delhi, I never learned Bangla to read and write. I can speak Bangla, but I learned Marathi and Hindi. So I actually taught myself to read Bengali when I did the PhD, because there's no other way you could do that kind of project without learning how to read Bengali. So I feel like all of this was very much in the background. Like even the idea of being a migrant within India had not registered until it came to doing these particular projects, which somehow brought me to Calcutta, and then actually thinking, well, you're not off the place, And even now of doing this project with, now of course I have specific, communities, but I never feel really I don't think, particularly I think that's striking in the chapters on the queer organization. It's not the kind of intimate ethnography like Nesargi Dave's is. I wasn't seen as very much part, like an insider to this community who was hanging out and staying over at people's homes. It's not like that at all. And again, that's something obviously I write about in the book, that what does that enable you to say and what does that not enable you to see? And in terms of, again, vulnerability, positionality, all of that, through the course of this research, I moved from the UK to South Africa. I had children. I went through quite a traumatic divorce. And it was always like, should I tell people? Should I not tell people? And funnily enough, I told the rural women who, in odd ways, I don't want to call it name it, right? Like, this is, what would you name it? Is it friendship? But actually it was mainly because they had kids. And I had kids. And suddenly that's what you talk about when you're, not that that's all you talk about, but you know what I mean? It just became kind of quite obvious that, and even now, if we have a phone call, we talk about our kids. So anyway, I don't know if that, Sweta, I don't know if that sort of also answers your point about positionality. Just again on, I'm just seeing Kush's question here, and this whole thing on naming. Partly it's, I suppose my job is easy in some ways because my interlocutors call themselves feminist and queer. Not all. And the rural women in some ways, Sweta, when you talk about your mother in the preface, they wouldn't call themselves feminist, even though that term is available in the vernacular. But yeah, in some other ways, it is like Sweta, I think, Kush, the project is also asking about, what are the politics of claiming this and what work is it doing?
Aarti, you have a question? Please go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah. Am I audible? Okay. So,
Breaking, Aarti. Ouch. Aarti, your voice is breaking.
To Sweta,
Try to speak again. Aarti, you want to type your question in the chat box instead? Hi, Aarti. Are you there?
Yeah. Is
Yeah,
this
yeah.
better?
Yeah, this is better. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a question to Sweta on accidental feminism. Now, if I heard you correctly, you said that a lot of women that you interview did not really identify as feminists. Now, non-identification in, say, several circumstances could have a lot of subversive potential. And I think queer theory would give, say, multiple examples. But if here, the reason for non-identification as a feminist was to, say, make oneself more palatable to the otherwise heteropatriarchal context of law firms, then would the term feminism be the right word there, even say accidental feminism? And this relates to, say, one more question, that by usage of the term feminism, because of, say, what the outcome of the work that, say, these women were doing, would confer some sort of redemption on the otherwise heteropatriarchal context. So that's my question.
Ati, thanks so much for that question, because I kept waiting for a question on why this was feminism, and I felt like I didn't get that. I didn't get it from anyone else that was asking it, and I was hoping somebody would hold me to task. So I really appreciate your question. So the first clarification is that I didn't ask these women how they identify. So this wasn't a project on feminism. Like, so writing about it happened way after I actually did the work. And so as I was clarifying earlier, it's much more the firms that I'm thinking of as having feminist potential rather than the women themselves. So it's about individual actors to think about organizational cultures. And so that's sort of like the main argument. And the very reason why it's not the women I'm thinking of is because this idea of feminine, and my sort of preface, as Srila has very graciously mentioned, is sort of does this work of thinking, how do you think of naming when the person is going to get advantage, right? So when because you're absolutely right in that not calling a thing, and I think this relates to Kush's question too, which is non-naming can actually have and I loved how you phrased it. Non-naming can have subversive potential, but it can also have like a sort of a redemptive value, as you just said, to those that don't deserve it. And I think you're absolutely right. But I just wanted to mention that it wasn't about the women claiming these labels or not claiming these labels. And it wasn't about me giving them those labels. This was not about the women. This was about organizational cultures that then produce what look like feminist outcomes. And the book allows us to sit with that really messy terrain of thinking of something as producing something that looks feminist, while actually it's quite ambiguous whether the people within them are feminist, or even if they are, if it's actually feminism. I think the larger question that you're asking, which I sort of again struggle with in the book and start to answer, but I don't think I finished answering it, is whether you can call a thing feminism. And this again, as I think everything I'm thinking about this week relates to bell hooks, and will continue to relate and invoke, her memory and wisdom in all sorts of ways. But I think because, Kush, you asked this question of how do we organize to challenge and change a system that cannot be named. And I think part of what's interesting to me is sort of the work that this does in the classroom, right? So what gets named or not get named is interesting in terms of organizational spaces that want to call themselves feminist versus not call themselves feminist. The version of thinking of that as feminism came to me in the classroom. So I teach an upper level class called GUILT in my law school, which is Gendered Understandings in Law and Legal Theory. And the first time I was teaching it, I had a student who said, why is Sarah Palin not a feminist? And so I go into this length in one of the footnotes about this. And much to my editor's annoyance, there's 30,000 words of footnotes for my preface. And part of that was sort of thinking through this idea of why, I was trying to explain to the student why it was not, and then thinking through this logics of, well, how do we claim a category that we are not the only ones that are the beneficiaries of? And what if it's doing a different kind of work of parity, of expansion, of production of outcomes that might help other future others by this accident that we don't yet know, right? So is it, and I don't think I'm claiming it as feminism, but I am claiming it as a kind of theoretical, this is why accident, I mean, rightfully is the more interesting part of the word, right? Because it modifies then what the word feminism is into thinking of it as a clubbed logic of the culture rather than the person, and allowing us to sit with what that can do, what kind of path dependencies that have, alongside this incredibly heteropatriarchal, non-subversive script that they are reproducing over and over and over again, that the book sort of calls on its head consistently. But I don't know if that starts to answer your question, but I just wanted to clarify it and also just say that was the logic of the non-naming, so to speak, and of the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
Of course, thanks for asking.
Sweta, but you did say that then brings up the yardstick of something called actual feminism, whether they are actual feminists or no. Is there anything, and keeping in mind the debate, the argument that Sheila has put forward, may I ask if there's anything called actual feminism?
Yeah, and that is why I love Sheila's book, right? Like reading it alongside mine. I really think they're sibling books. So I don't know how we didn't think of doing a version of the Salon before, because I don't think there's actual anything. I find it really hard to believe in these categories with too much commitment, right? I think it's the crevices between these categories that allow us way to think about it. So is there an actual feminism? To a lot of people, I'm sure there is. And maybe I like ambiguity, or maybe I'm comfortable in ambiguity in the ways others are not. And maybe that queer method in itself must be introspected. Like we can keep going in those loops, right? But I think actual and real are actually secure neoliberal concepts that allow people to feel good about their identity. And not that that's wrong, right? Like, I mean, if I'm claiming an identity and saying I'm queer, what that identity means versus what it doesn't mean is different for different people. And I don't have to out myself and claim the sort of confines of that category to every single person. But I think there is a real that gets performed when a non-real is seen. So I think, Aarti, the way you are phrasing it, right? Like that is how I came to the theorizing every single time I would think about it, which is that this is not real feminism. Like I would, even as I was writing it, I was like, but this is not real. And then I was like, but what is real, right? And so part of the preface really struggles with this idea of like, how do you call a thing that's not a thing, especially since it's the non-naming that has produced this outcome. Right. And Kush, that goes to your question too, which is that if these firms had started off calling themselves feminist firms, there's no way they would have actually produced these outcomes because they'd have gotten all the wrong attention. And the answer here, of course, nothing about this is to say intentional movements are not to be given valorization, right? Like those are very, very important movements, but it's also to look elsewhere for what that work, I mean, what kind of work is happening there.
Can I just jump in here? And I mean, I just think this is the, this is the I suppose what I always start, the classroom with, like for feminism to be something, it has to not be, it's something that it's not, right? So we can argue, so in a way, and that goes against what the book is saying. In a sense, the book is trying to show the problems, the limits of deploying feminism as a normative project. Right. So moment there's a sense of this is what it ought to look like, this is what a real feminist or a good feminist ought to, etc. Always someone who falls short. Political lesbians are policing, apolitical lesbians. I mean, the whole history of feminism is just an iteration of the same dynamics not same, but there's a lot of empirical evidence, let's put it like that, right? So on the one hand, the book wants to trouble this idea of what it ought to look like. And that's implicit in, I think, what you were saying, Sweta, about, I think that's exactly what you said, which is what Atrey repeated, like what a feminism looks like. But having said that, how do then we teach feminism, or how do we, much more to the point, politically mobilize through claiming this name without thinking about what feminism is not? Because then we fall precisely into that trajectory where we say, oh, well, it's choice feminism, it's right-wing feminism, it's anything that is a project which has women and furthers women interests is feminist, and it's not, right? And in fact, I remember now the Sindre Bangstad piece against Sabah Mahmood does this really well, where they basically say, but actually, this is the kind of project which then opens up, because I think that's what if we all recall what Mahmood does at the start, remember in her preface, I think she does this kind of, sort of a normative and a non-normative or something that I can't recall. But so, yeah, I don't know. I think it's a tricky one, and it's a tricky one for this particular moment where anything and everything can be claimed as feminist. And I think it is kind of politically important to hang on to something, to at the very least make that distinction, to say, no, but this isn't it, right?
We're almost out of time. If we have time maybe for a last question, if anyone has their hand up. I don't see any hands. Well, thank you, Sweta and Srila. We are very, very happy that your books are out in the world, and we hope they'll be available in India very soon. Do let us know, and I know that our library is getting Sweta's book very, very soon. We hope to get our library to acquire Sheila's book also next year once it's out. But we also hope to have Indian publications bring them out so that we can also own copies of the two books in our own bookshelves, where we don't have to pay Duke University or Princeton University prices. Thank you so much for making the time. And we hope to meet Sweta at least very sometime soon in person. And Sheila, the jury's out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you very soon. Bye. Good night.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us. This was so fun.
Yeah, it was amazing.
It was so fun.
For curating this series.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shushmita.
Truly,
Thank you
Sushmita.
guys
Thank
for
you so
making it.
much.
It was so much fun. It was so great, even though it was on Zoom. I wish we could do it in person. It would have been so many times.
When Shrila's
Not
book
complaining.
comes out, that's what we're going to do.
We're gonna have a book, feminist book
Let's
party.
have a book launch.
Yeah, we'll have a book
Party.
launch. I'll be Pehla Wala commentator. We should do that. We should do it in the fall of 2022.
Yeah, hopefully there'll be no Omicron, iterations at that point.
Yeah, but there'll still be racist travel bans, people. It's not the variant.
That's true. Fair. Fair.
Final
No,
words.
but we'll be hopeful. We will not be.
Yeah, I refuse to be hopeful. It's
Oh,
just a
actually,
long time.
everyone can just come to South Africa because, hey, we never have a travel ban.
I know.
We're like
I mean, as someone with an Indian passport, I probably can come to India. I mean, I can't go back to the US after that, but yeah, I'll come. Aarti, thanks for your question. I feel like I didn't answer it fully, but I promise you the
and
book
to
struggle-
Kush, thank you.
Yeah, and to Kush, I feel like
Thank
I actually saw your tweet this morning, and that's literally how I started class.
This was lovely, and just to be able to hear you and sort of engage in this virtual space. So thank you to both of you, and to Sushmita and to Atri, to everybody who's made this possible. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah.
All
Akash,
right. Yeah.
Akash,
Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thanks, Akash. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.
Thanks for moderating, Atri.
Thank you.
Bye.